Some people leave social media for a reason that looks simple from the outside. They say they got tired of it, but that usually isn't the whole story. Sometimes they left because they noticed something quietly unsettling. Their life started feeling less like a life and more like a surface. They were still having experiences, but somewhere in the background, they were also monitoring how those experiences might appear. Not posting doesn't always come from disinterest. Sometimes it comes from exhaustion. A very specific kind of exhaustion. The kind that happens when your inner life never gets to stay inside. When every feeling starts passing through an invisible checkpoint. Is this interesting enough? Is this attractive enough? Is this polished enough? Some people don't quit social media because they hate attention. They quit because attention started changing the shape of their mind. They noticed they were becoming easier to interrupt. Not just by notifications, by the imagined presence of other people. Even in private moments, there was suddenly a room in their head, an audience that wasn't physically there, but never fully left. And that changes a person more than most people realize. Because when you're always being mentally observed, you stop relating to yourself directly. You begin relating to yourself through projection. You don't just feel sad. You also sense how your sadness would be perceived. You don't just enjoy a dinner. A part of you starts translating it into something shareable. That constant self-translation is draining. It creates a subtle split. There is the self that is living, and there is the self that is watching the self live. That split doesn't look dramatic. It looks normal now. That's why it gets missed. A woman is out with friends and keeps reaching for her phone during the quiet parts. Not because anything urgent happened, because silence has become unfamiliar unless it's filled. A man takes a weekend trip and comes back strangely unrested. Nothing went wrong. He just never fully arrived anywhere. Part of him stayed busy, keeping mental notes for a version of himself that might be seen later. This is one of the hidden costs of social media. It can train you to remain slightly outside your own life. Not absent, just never completely inside it. And for emotionally sensitive people, that cost lands even deeper, because they already feel a lot. They already notice tone shifts, facial changes, social tension, unspoken judgment. So when digital life adds another layer of social awareness, it doesn't feel light. It feels invasive. Not always in a loud way. Sometimes in the quietest way possible. They begin censoring thoughts before fully thinking them. They begin styling emotions before fully feeling them. They begin trimming parts of themselves that don't photograph well. Over time, this can create a strange kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being unseen, the loneliness of being seen in ways that don't feel true. That kind of loneliness is confusing, because from the outside, a person may look connected. People know their updates, they react to their stories, they send quick hearts and tiny affirmations. But very little of that touches the deeper hunger underneath. To be known without being packaged, to be felt without being performed, to have a self that is not always available for interpretation. Some people leave social media because they miss that feeling. The feeling of being psychologically unadvertised, of having a day that belongs only to the day, of thinking a thought that doesn't immediately become material. That doesn't mean they're more evolved than everyone else. It means they became protective of something fragile. Their unedited attention, their private emotional pace, their ability to discover what they actually feel before the world gets a vote. And that matters more in adulthood than people admit, because adult life already asks you to perform in so many places. At work, in relationships, in family roles, in dating, in polite conversations where you say you're fine before checking whether you are. A lot of adults are carrying around too many versions of themselves already. Professional self, family self, competent self, easygoing self, healing self, desired self. The online self can become one more mask, and for some people, that is exactly why they leave. Not because they have nothing to say, because they can no longer hear themselves clearly with that many selves talking at once. What looks like withdrawal is sometimes integration. What looks like disappearance is sometimes repair. They're trying to become one person again. The kind of person who doesn't need to convert every experience into identity evidence. The kind of person who can enjoy a morning without asking what it says about them. The kind of person who can be ordinary without feeling erased. That last part is bigger than it sounds, because social media quietly punishes ordinary life. Not directly, but enough to make people feel they should always be becoming something more visible, more impressive, more defined, more legible. But real life is not always legible. Some of the healthiest seasons of a person's life look unimpressive from the outside. Going to bed earlier, keeping a promise to yourself, learning how not to text back immediately when you're hurt, making dinner at home, letting a friendship become quieter without turning it into a public grief. These things don't always create content, but they create a self. And some people finally realize they would rather build a self than maintain a feed. There is also a relationship shift that happens when someone steps away. They stop confusing access with closeness. They notice how many interactions were only maintenance, not intimacy. A birthday reaction is not the same as remembering someone's voice when they're tired. Watching someone's life is not the same as standing inside it with them. And once a person feels that difference, they can't unfeel it. They become less impressed by constant contact, more interested in emotional honesty, more drawn to the friend who knocks on the door than the one who watches every story, more touched by the slow conversation after midnight than 100 passive check-ins. This is why people who leave social media sometimes get quieter for a while. They're recalibrating. They are learning which relationships can survive without performance scaffolding. That can be painful. Some connections fade the minute they are no longer being lightly fed. Some people only know how to keep you in their life when you're visible. And that realization can sting. Not because it is cruel, because it is clarifying. It shows you who was attached to your presence and who was attached to your availability. Those are not the same thing. Another thing people rarely say out loud is this: social media can make self-respect more unstable. Not because confidence disappears overnight, because your emotional baseline gets quietly negotiated by feedback. A good photo can lift you, silence can shrink you. A post you almost didn't share can suddenly decide your mood for the afternoon. Even when you know better, your nervous system still registers the signal. And eventually, some people get tired of handing their self-worth over in tiny, invisible installments. So they leave. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just one day they decide their mind deserves a less crowded room. And what surprises them is not the emptiness, it is the relief. Relief that no one needs anything from their face today. Relief that a beautiful moment can remain incomplete and still be enough. Relief that they can change without announcing it. That might be the deepest psychology of all. Some people do not leave social media to disconnect from others. They leave so they can reconnect with their own experience before it gets edited by expectation. They want to know what they find funny when no one is watching, what they believe when nobody rewards the belief, what kind of life feels meaningful when it isn't being mirrored back to them. That is not avoidance. That is a very mature kind of curiosity. And yes, sometimes it will make them look distant. Sometimes other people will call them private, hard to read, even detached. But often they are not detached at all. They are finally attached to something real. Their attention, their nervous system, their relationships that can breathe without constant proof, their inner life that no longer has to audition for relevance. And in a world that keeps asking people to become more visible, there is something quietly brave about choosing depth instead, about choosing a smaller, truer life over a larger, thinner one, about letting your identity be felt by the people who matter instead of displayed for the people who don't. So, if you've stepped away from social media and wondered whether you're becoming strange, maybe you're not. Maybe you're becoming harder to manipulate. Maybe you're becoming harder to rush. Maybe you're becoming the kind of person who would rather have a real life than a visible one. And if that costs you a little attention, but gives you back your mind, that is not a loss. That is a return to your own timing, a return to your own thoughts, a return to the version of you that doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. And for a lot of people, that is not withdrawal from life. That is the first honest step back into it.